Hello, everybody, and welcome to today's technical discussion. My name is Christy Duncan, and I will be your host for today's session. Today, we will be talking about the NPD Closure Project's Draft Environmental Assessment Follow-Up Monitoring Program. While we have been tracking public input on the program, just one moment, please. We're just going to give people a couple more minutes to see if anyone joins before we do a deep dive into today's session. But as I was saying, I'm your host, Christy Duncan. Today, we are going to be talking about the NPD Closure Project, specifically focusing on the draft follow-up monitoring program. And so we've been tracking public input on this program for the past few years. And the goal of today's session is to solicit further input from you all on the project, focusing on the monitoring program. Just going to give a few more minutes for people to sign in. Okay, so as people trickle in, I just want to go over a couple of housekeeping items, introduce the topic further. And before I go any further, I would like to acknowledge that the NPD Closure Project is located on the unceded and unsurrendered territory of the Algonquin and Anishinaabe people. This is an important acknowledgement in today's context of the discussion because the NPD Closure Project is part of CNL's environmental stewardship mission, and CNL recognizes First Nations, Métis, and Inuit as stewards of the land. So it is important that we not only acknowledge that connection, but also meaningfully engage with them to ensure that the project continues to be protective of the environment for generations to come. Today's session is going to focus on the effluent and environmental plan. So I hope that you all can attend our second technical discussion happening on Thursday, where we're going to be focusing more on groundwater monitoring. A couple of housekeeping items I want to go over with you guys. The first being that there is simultaneous interpretation of this discussion. And what that means is that you can access this discussion in either French or English through the globe icon at the bottom right bar on your screen. Simply select the language you would like to hear, and just please note that there is a slight lag in the translation, so just wait until the full translation is coming through before speaking. We just ask that for this session you speak clearly, and if you do have a headset like mine, please use it because it helps with clarity. Today's session is planned for an hour and a half, and we anticipate the presentation to take around 30 minutes, and the rest of the time is focused on discussion. You can ask questions at any time during the presentation, and in fact, we have incorporated some prompt questions for you guys throughout the presentation for your consideration and input. Please note that the chat icon is at the bottom right-hand of your screen as well. And for today's session, we just ask that you keep yourself muted to ensure that the sound quality is clear for everybody. If you do have a question, please simply raise your hand and I will call on you to unmute, or alternatively, you can type in your question in the chat. As I said, the chat function and icon is just at the bottom of your screen. We'd just like you to note that this session is recorded and we post them on our YouTube channels. And so we want you guys to be aware of this because When you share your thoughts in the chat or ask a question, there is an option to either share your name or remain anonymous. Either one is fine with us. It's up to you guys. And if you'd like to speak, again, I will call out your name on as it's shown on the Zoom screen. If you are having technical difficulties, either during the presentation, please just let us know. You can get in touch with us at ermstakeholder@cnl.ca, and a team and a representative of our team will be monitoring that inbox, so we'll get you all sorted out quite quickly. So that's ermstakeholder@cnl.ca. And while we will try to get through all of everybody's questions, if we aren't able to address your question now, we will be sending out an email from that email to you all with the responses. So a couple of participation guidelines for you all today that I think everyone can agree to. For this session, everyone has wisdom, and we need everyone's wisdom for the wisest results, which is why public engagement on these projects is so important to us. Number two, there are no silly questions. If you have a question that's related to the content and the material being presented, please don't hesitate to raise that hand or to type it in the chat, because we are really interested in hearing from you. And number three, everyone will be respectful of each other and everyone's time. And then the context of today's call, that means making sure that you're on mute when the presenter is presenting or when somebody else is speaking. And then if you have a question, simply raise your hand or type it in the chat. And then in terms of everyone's time, we did start on time, and we will end on time to be respectful of other things going on in your day. So without further ado, I would like to introduce you to the panelists for today's session. So panelists, as I call out your name, if you could just turn on your camera quickly and give people a wave so they know who you are. So from the NPD project side, with us today, we have Katie Shorter. Katie is the acting regulatory manager for the NPD project. We also have with us Juliette Louise. Juliette Louise is the project's environmental analyst, and Juliette is going to be our main presenter for today's session. Over on the environmental protection side, we have Carla DeWale, and Carla DeWale is our section head for the monitoring program. In addition, we also have Annie Morin. Annie is the section head of resource management. She's calling in from Ottawa today. And that is it from me. So with that, I will turn things over to Juliette to get us kicked off. So Juliette, take it away.
Great. Thank you, Christy. Good afternoon, everyone. Today, I will present an overview of proposed monitoring activities for the NPD closure project, focusing on effluent and environmental monitoring. On Thursday, April 14th, as Christy mentioned, there will be another workshop focused on groundwater monitoring. So the purpose, to reiterate today, is firstly to provide an opportunity for feedback about the monitoring plans, and secondly, to describe some of the feedback that we've received so far and how we are addressing that feedback. We've had a few workshops and presentations about follow-up monitoring for the NPD closure project over the past few years. Gathering ongoing feedback on this topic is very important to us. So we do regular outreach initiatives to continue seeking feedback on this topic. And one important note, when we do receive feedback and suggestions, so for example, to add a monitoring location or to change monitoring frequency, we don't have a yes or no answer right away. We take that feedback to our subject matter experts to really evaluate the justification for the change before deciding if the monitoring plans should be updated. So I'll begin with a brief overview of where NPD is located and the monitoring that we currently do at and around the site. I'll review the concept of in situ disposal, which is the objective of the NPD closure project. Then I'll talk about the proposed effluent monitoring for the project, which is monitoring of emissions from project activities. And I'll talk about the feedback we've received so far. And then I'll review the proposed environmental monitoring activities, and that includes monitoring to ensure protection of the Ottawa River and biodiversity. And again, I'll talk about the feedback we've received on environmental monitoring so far. And then I will wrap up with a few discussion questions to encourage more feedback on the proposed monitoring activities. The NPD site is located along the Trans-Canada Highway, halfway between North Bay and Ottawa, and it's located on the south shore of the Ottawa River. The image on the right shows a zoomed in view of the site with the Trans-Canada Highway running across the bottom and the NPD main road that leads to the developed area of the site. The whole site is approximately 380 hectares and is mostly undisturbed forest. The developed part of the site occupies less than 1% of the whole property. NPD was the first nuclear reactor in Canada to put electricity to the grid. It operated from 1962 to 1987, and it was a 22 megawatt electric pressurized heavy water reactor. It was the training center for many operators and engineers of the Canadian nuclear industry. In 1987, after it completed its mission to show that nuclear power could be used to generate electricity in Canada, the reactor was placed in a safe shutdown state. There was then a first phase of decommissioning, during which the reactor was defueled and drained. The fuel and heavy water were transferred to Chalk River. The non-nuclear components and structures that were no longer needed were removed, and the NPD reactor building has been in a safe shutdown state for over 30 years. So now I'll review monitoring that takes place currently at the NPD site and around the site. At NPD, we do formal effluent monitoring in accordance to CSA N288.5, and it includes monitoring of both waterborne and airborne emissions. For waterborne emissions, we sample water that flows through a tile drain system that's installed below ground around the perimeter of the building. This tile drain diverts groundwater to the Ottawa River in order to keep the facility dry. So there's two main outlets of the tile drain system: tile drain 1 at the top of the figure, and tile drain 2, which is the purple line on the right side of the figure. Water is sampled from a manhole located over tile drain 1, and that's labeled MH-2 on the figure. It's sampled twice a year for tritium and gross beta, and both of these parameters are less than 0.01% of their derived release limits. This year, we're including a new sampling location on tile drain 2, which you can see on the right of the figure. Recent investigations confirmed low but steady flow through this tile drain, so it will be monitored for the same parameters and at the same frequency as we do at manhole 2. Airborne emissions from the ventilation stack are monitored for tritium and gross beta. And again, both of these parameters are less than 0.01% of their derived release limits. The results of effluent monitoring confirms that the public and environment around the NPD facility are protected. And results of effluent monitoring are reported to the CNSC on an annual basis. So in addition to the formal effluent monitoring, there is also what we call operational control monitoring that takes place just to confirm that NPD continues to have a very low impact on the environment. The map on the left shows where the Ottawa River is currently sampled for radioactivity. So it's sampled just upstream of Rolfton, which you can see on the left, and then also at Deep River. Results show no difference between the upstream and downstream locations. So for example, tritium is about 3 becquerels per liter, both upstream and downstream of NPD. And then for context, this is far below the Health Canada guidelines for drinking water quality, which is 7,000 becquerels per liter. The figure on the right shows where radiation in air is monitored using thermoluminescent dosimeters, or TLDs. Those are the red dots on the map, and where tritium and in soil and vegetation is monitored, and that's the purple squares on the map. NPD has a very small impact on the environment, and every year a summary of monitoring results is posted on CNL's external website, and you can see the link there below the image on the right on your screen. So this slide graphically depicts in situ disposal, which is the method CNL is proposing to complete the decommissioning and closure of the NPD facility. The image on the top left shows the current state of the facility. To give an idea of scale, the deepest part of the facility extends to almost 100 feet below ground within bedrock. The image at the bottom shows in situ disposal in progress. The existing concrete structure would remain in place. Some of the concrete walls of the facility are 8 to 9 feet thick. The systems and structures that are currently in the facility would remain in the facility. The above ground portion of the building would be demolished and placed in the open spaces of the facility, and the facility would be filled with grout. There would be a small batch plant on the site to prepare the grout. The part of the facility that contains the nuclear structures would be covered with a concrete cap, and then the whole footprint of the building will be covered with an engineered cover system with vegetation on top. The end result would be a waste disposal facility at the NPD site. CNL believes that in situ disposal is protective of the environment because it contains and isolates the contaminants within the grouted facility. The image on the right shows what the site would look like once demolition and grouting is complete. You can see that the stack will remain because it's a roosting site for chimney swift birds, which are a species at risk. So what is follow-up monitoring? It's a formal part of the federal environmental assessment process. The objectives are to verify predictions from the environmental impact statement, or EIS, to ensure mitigation measures are performing as expected and identify any unanticipated effects, to limit unanticipated effects by incorporating the concept of adaptive management, to incorporate Indigenous knowledge into monitoring activities. CNL is working very closely with several Indigenous communities and organizations to collaborate on monitoring activities. There are 3 separate documents that describe monitoring activities, one each for effluent, environmental, and groundwater monitoring, and each of which is aligned to the respective CSA standard. The follow-up monitoring plans have been available since 2019, and we have been tracking feedback that we've received so far, and we will be revising the plans to reflect some of the feedback that we've received. The plans are in a draft state now and will only be finalized after an EA decision by the CNSC, because there may be additional monitoring requirements in the EA decision that we will include in the plans before finalizing them. So when does follow-up monitoring start and end? Follow-up monitoring begins essentially now before the project starts with the collection of baseline data, which will give us a snapshot of current environmental conditions so that we will have something to compare future monitoring results to. Follow-up monitoring will continue throughout the decommissioning execution phase, which will last roughly 2 years. And this is when the demolition, grouting, and installation of the cap and cover takes place. Monitoring will continue for the duration of the institutional control phase, which is a period of a minimum of 100 years, where active monitoring and surveillance will take place. It's important to emphasize that the duration of institutional controls is a minimum of 100 years, and regulatory approval is required before this phase can be terminated. And just a note on abbreviations. Later on in this presentation, you'll see decommissioning execution phase abbreviated as DE, and the institutional control phase abbreviated as IC, just to save room on the slides. So now I'll present the details of effluent and environmental monitoring during the decommissioning, execution, and institutional control phases. I'll review the sampling locations, parameters, and frequencies, and I'll present the feedback that we've received so far and how we've responded to the feedback. The feedback so far has come from various sources, from Indigenous peoples, the public, government departments, and also internally from CNL employees. At the end of the presentation, I'll talk about adaptive management and reporting of results and how to get in touch with us if you have feedback and questions that require a more in-depth discussion. So first, I will describe air and liquid effluent monitoring during both phases of the project. This will be a rather brief overview because we had a full day in-person workshop back in 2019 on this topic. So air quality and dust will be monitored during the decommissioning execution phase. The project would interact with the atmospheric environment in a few ways. Dust would be generated from demolition, operation of the batch plant, and assembly of the concrete cap and cover system. Also, as grout is placed inside the facility, it would displace the air from inside the facility to the outside environment, and there would also be emissions from vehicles. We'll be using high volume air samplers with filters to measure air quality, both radioactive and non-radioactive particles. It will be run continuously and the filters will be analyzed on a monthly basis. We recently purchased these units, so they will be set up this spring to start collecting baseline air quality information. In terms of feedback, we heard that dust monitoring should take place at more than one location. The plan currently describes just one location for monitoring at the guardhouse, which you can see circled in yellow, but there would be dust generated at the batch plant as well. So in response to that feedback, we will be incorporating visual monitoring for dust and looking into handheld monitors to enable mobile dust monitoring. A benefit of visual monitoring is that it will help us quickly know when we need to apply more mitigation measures like misting for dust suppression. Another improvement we made was to locate the high volume air samplers where the red star is, that's in the NPD parking lot, rather than at the guardhouse to align with more recent air modeling results. And for monitoring of fuel emissions, the plan describes measuring diesel emissions, but after some internal discussion, it would be more accurate to estimate diesel emissions through tracking of fuel use in vehicles. So for liquid effluent, during the decommissioning execution phase, there are two sources. So if water accumulates inside the facility during demolition and grouting, it would be analyzed for radioactive and non-radioactive parameters of interest and managed at Chalk River Laboratories. Also, the batch plant would have lined washout pits where vehicles would be rinsed. This water would be analyzed for radioactive and non-radioactive parameters of interest as well, listed on the screen. What we will try to do is reuse that water if possible in the grout mixing process. If not, they will be analyzed for radioactive and non-radioactive parameters of interest, and depending on the results, the water would either be discharged to ground if it's clean, otherwise it would be sent to Chalk River for management. During the institutional control phase, there won't be as many effluent generating activities because the decommissioning activities will be complete, but there will still be emissions from vehicles and equipment that go to site for monitoring and maintenance activities. So we will continue to report on dust and diesel emissions for greenhouse gas reporting and reporting to the National Pollutant Release Inventory, or NPRI. In terms of liquid effluents during the institutional control phase, because effluents are defined as controlled releases, there aren't any liquid effluents during this phase according to the CSA and 288.5 definition. The groundwater that passes through the grouted facility will be monitored as part of the groundwater monitoring program, which we will review on Thursday, April 14th. And similarly, any surface water drainage will be monitored as part of the environmental monitoring program, and that I will describe a little bit later on in this presentation. So that was an overview of effluent monitoring for the NPD closure project. We have a pause now for questions. We're looking for questions or feedback on air effluent monitoring during the decommissioning, execution, and institutional control phases, or the proposed liquid effluent monitoring during either of the project phases. Christy, have we seen any questions come in so far?
No, but while people ponder these questions, I will just draw your attention. So if you do want to raise your hand and ask a question, simply go down to the bottom bar of the Zoom and select reactions. It should be a smiley face with a plus. So you click on that and there's a function to raise your hand. So we do have a question coming in from Tyler. Tyler wants to know, with regards to effluent monitoring, are there known natural sources of tritium in the water that could contribute to the upstream results being similar to the downstream? Samples collected upstream and downstream NPD. Are the upstream results adequate for consideration as background?
For that question, I'm going to ask Carla to help out with that question.
Sure. Hi, everybody. So I'm Carla. So what we're trying to distinguish when when we talk about indicator monitoring locations and background monitoring locations, the background is basically our baseline, the baseline that's unaffected by, say, potential contributions from NPD operations, in this case, the NPD decommissioning, execution, or the institutional control phase. So the locations monitored upstream of NPD would fit that bill. And so what we're trying to see is there an impact on the Ottawa River, the tritium in the Ottawa River, that can be attributed to the activities going on at NPD? I hope that answers the question. So, so yes, the upstream results are adequate for consideration as a background or a baseline to be able to assess the contribution of NPD activities. Did that answer the question?
Yep. So Carla, that looks like your response was adequate, and we just were wondering about natural sources of tritium.
So there would be some natural sources of tritium, yes. We have the capability of detecting tritium at very low levels in the Ottawa River as part of the overall Chalk River monitoring program, environmental monitoring program, which are published, the results of which are published in an annual report that's available to the public. You know, one can see, we share graphs of tritium concentrations upstream, downstream. Anyways, we can get to levels of detection of 0.5 becquerels per liter. And even in upstream locations, one will detect, that level of tritium concentration that's not attributable to any CNL operations.
Okay, thank you, Carla. So just monitoring the chat as well as the participants. So yeah, if you do have any questions, just raise your hand by clicking on the reaction and clicking the raise hand function. So I'll give people a few more moments. And if a question comes up during the presentation, please just raise your hand and we can pause and answer that question. So yeah, over to you, Juliet, to continue.
Okay, I just wanted to read out. Can you read that message from Martin? Tritium is generated in the atmosphere. I believe there are natural sources of tritium and concentrations are negligible. Okay, so I don't see any other questions come in, so I will proceed to environmental monitoring. So now I will cover environmental monitoring, and that covers a whole range of areas: ambient radioactivity, noise, on-site surface water, and the Ottawa River. I'll talk about secondary monitoring, which we call triggered monitoring. And this is additional monitoring that would take place if there is an exceedance in one of the primary monitoring activities. I'll talk about sediment, fish habitat, and benthic macroinvertebrate monitoring, which is an example of triggered monitoring. And I'll wrap up with biodiversity monitoring, which includes species at risk. So for ambient radioactivity, gamma dose rate will be measured using thermoluminescent dosimeters, or TLDs, during both the decommissioning execution and institutional control phases. The 4 locations are shown in blue diamonds on the map. These locations currently have thermoluminescent dosimeters and are part of what we call operational control monitoring, which takes place to confirm that NPD currently has a minimal impact on the environment. Monitoring would be continuous, and analysis is specified for a quarterly basis. So we've received feedback on this topic, specifically that we should review the air dispersion modeling and ensure we have TLDs in the areas of highest modeled airborne radioactivity. So that is something that we will be doing. The environmental monitoring plan describes one location for noise monitoring at the entrance to the site near the Trans-Canada Highway, that's shown in blue on the map. Noise would be measured in decibels and would be monitored continuously during periods of high activity. In 2020, we took some baseline noise measurements, and to plan for this, we worked with our industrial hygiene and biology staff, and we determined that we should have more than one noise monitoring location. So here you'll see a map with 12 locations where we did baseline noise monitoring in 2020. And there was also one location off-site in Swisha, which is the nearest community to NPD. So as expected, the results show that noise on the NPD site is typical of a quiet rural area and noisier near the highway. During the decommissioning execution phase, we will monitor noise at these locations, but not all at the same time. Rather, we would monitor for a certain amount of time at each of these locations during periods of high activity. In terms of feedback, we showed this map at an engagement event, and we were asked to monitor noise on the Quebec shoreline on the other side of the river. So we discussed this request internally, and we determined that since we have several noise monitoring locations around where the project activities will take place, those locations will provide the most conservative noise measurements. For monitoring of on-site surface water during the decommissioning execution phase, tritium and gross beta will be monitored monthly at manhole 2, that's labeled MH2 on the figure on the left. This manhole is located over tile drain 1, which I described earlier, and that's the red line on the figure on the left. Manhole 2 is within the planned footprint of the cover system and will become unavailable for sampling at some point during the decommissioning execution phase. So once this location is no longer available, the tile drain will be monitored as part of the groundwater monitoring plan. There's going to be a groundwater monitoring well located beside this tile drain, but beyond the footprint of the cover system. So we received feedback that monitoring should take place as well along tile drain 2, which is the purple line on the right of the figure. This feedback coincided with the investigation of this tile drain that took place late last year. The red dot on the figure shows the approximate location where the tile drain was excavated, and that was done in November last year. As I described earlier in this presentation, the investigation confirmed low but steady flow through this tile drain. So we will be monitoring at this location, similar to how we monitor at manhole 2. We also received feedback that the wetlands on the NPD site should be monitored. And the map on the right of the slide indicates some of the wetlands on the NPD property. The EIS predicts no impacts on the wetlands. They are quite far from the project site. There's no roads going to the wetlands, and groundwater from the project site flows towards the river and not towards the wetlands. But regardless, CNL is planning to arrange a site visit with the group who made this request to further discuss this topic. Monitoring of the Ottawa River is another extremely important aspect of monitoring. During the decommissioning execution phase, the Ottawa River will be monitored right offshore of NPD. That's the first yellow dot on the satellite photo. And then the 2 dots downstream, those are points added on during the institutional control phase, because that's the flow path that groundwater would follow once it reaches the river. And then if you look at the map on the right, we will also monitor the river upstream of NPD at Dejuashim Dam and downstream at Deep River. As I mentioned earlier, CNL currently monitors at these upstream and downstream locations for radioactivity, but we will also add on monitoring for non-radioactive parameters of interest, for example, lead, mercury, PCBs, and pH. We plan to start baseline monitoring of the river at these locations in the near future at a frequency of 4 times a year, and then continue monitoring throughout the decommissioning, execution, and institutional control phases. So now I'll describe the secondary monitoring or triggered monitoring. This is additional monitoring of the environment that would be initiated if we see unexpected monitoring results in the primary monitoring. So the primary monitoring is on the left side of the screen, and on the right is the secondary monitoring that would take place if required. The concept of triggered monitoring links the 3 monitoring plans together. So for example, if there is an exceedance in groundwater monitoring, then that would trigger sediment monitoring, which is in the environmental monitoring plan. And the slide shows the relationship between the primary and the secondary monitoring activities. So today I'll focus on sediment and benthic macroinvertebrate monitoring. That's circled in blue, and that would be initiated if there's an exceedance in either groundwater or surface water. So the monitoring locations for sediment and benthic macroinvertebrates would be just offshore of NPD, as well as upstream and downstream of the site. Sediment would be monitored for radioactivity and non-radioactive parameters of interest. We received feedback that baseline information for sediment and benthic macroinvertebrates is very important if we want to confirm the EIS prediction of no impact. So in 2020, there was a comprehensive baseline study of sediment and macroinvertebrates, benthic macroinvertebrates. So on the satellite photo, you can see 5 yellow transect lines extending into the river where samples were taken. And there was also 1 transect upstream at Rofton and 1 downstream at Deep River. All radionuclides measured were less than the derived concentration guideline levels, which are based on unconditional clearance levels. The results for non-radiological parameters are typical of what has been observed for Ottawa River sediments in other studies. Metal concentrations reflect local geology for the most part. There are some elevated metal concentrations in sediment, for example, mercury and arsenic, but these are regionally elevated and not just in the areas of CNL sites. The benthic macroinvertebrate community near NPD is healthy and typical of what's observed in many large soft-bodied river systems. In terms of feedback, we heard also that sediment monitoring should be done on a regular basis and not just as a triggered monitoring activity. So we are going to evaluate whether sediment monitoring should be a primary activity or if it makes sense to keep it as a triggered monitoring activity. So now I'll move on to describe biodiversity monitoring, starting with chimney swifts, who use the NPD ventilation stack as a roosting site from May to the end of August. The monitoring protocol on the left column of the table was developed by a chimney swift expert to ensure that we can detect any behavioral changes that may indicate an adverse impact from project activities. During the decommissioning execution phase, it includes weekly counts, as well as monitoring if swifts remain in the stack or return to the stack during inclement weather, during the non-breeding periods, and then daily roost counts during the breeding season, which is when the population using the stack is relatively stable. And then during the institutional control phase, it includes weekly roost counts for 3 years and continued participation in national roost count days. In addition to this monitoring, there have been some recent additions stemming from discussion with Environment and Climate Change Canada. So we are working towards monitoring passive airflow and temperature inside the stack, starting in the near future and then continuing on throughout both project phases. So this will enable us to understand the conditions inside the stack before, during, and after closure activities. We are also working towards installing a camera at the top of the stack, which will help us view the swifts inside and better understand their behavior when they're inside the stack. We have other species at risk on the site, and we will be monitoring for those as well. For bats, we will be doing surveys around the facility and site sweeps prior to work in the decommissioning execution phase. For milk snakes, we will do road mortality surveys during the milk snake active season, as well as site sweeps prior to working in an area. And for monarch butterfly, we will be replanting milkweed in the batch plant area after decommissioning activities are complete. And this milkweed will be surveyed every year for 3 years to collect information on milkweed establishment and the use of milkweed by life stages of the monarch butterfly. So we're also undertaking some additional biodiversity monitoring activities in response to feedback. We are monitoring the use of the shoreline by the Ottawa River by waterfowl during the spring and fall migration periods. And we will be updating the forest songbird survey at NPD since the last survey took place over 5 years ago. Just to note, the EIS predicts no impact to waterfowl and songbirds, but this is a good opportunity to have good comprehensive baseline data before the project begins. So that is a summary of the environmental monitoring activities. And here we have another pause for questions. We're looking for feedback on environmental monitoring. If you have feedback on monitoring locations or parameters or frequency during both project phases. And just as a reminder, we covered ambient radioactivity, noise, on-site surface water quality, Ottawa River water quality, secondary monitoring, which we call triggered monitoring, sediment, fish habitat, and benthic macroinvertebrates, and biodiversity. I just realized I didn't talk about fish habitat monitoring. There was, at the same time that the sediment and benthic macroinvertebrate study took place, there was a drone survey of the inside of the river adjacent to NPD, just to characterize the type of substrate and the type of fish that may use the river in front of NPD. So that's our baseline, and that can, if the study needs to be repeated in the future, we have that baseline to refer back to. Christy, any questions came in?
Yeah, thanks, Juliet, for that great presentation. Always more to learn. Okay, we do have a question coming in from Tyler. So Tyler wants to know any periphoton sampling proposed with sediment and benthic macroinvertebrates. That's part 1, and then part 2 is periphoton, and apologies if I'm not saying that right, a useful indicator or the presence of anthropogenically generated radionuclides?
So for this question, we have a subject matter expert who did this sediment and benthic macroinvertebrate study for us. I don't have a background in that area, but if this is a topic area that you want to have a detailed discussion on, we would be happy to organize a separate discussion on sediment and benthic macroinvertebrate monitoring. So if that's something that interests you, please do let us know, and we'll make sure we have the appropriate subject matter expert available to answer those questions.
Yeah, so everybody and Tyler, this is a great example of a question that we will get back to you on. So you will receive a follow-up email, Tyler, with our response, as well as an invitation to meet further to discuss. So looking at the participants list and just checking if anyone has their hand up. Just a reminder that you just go down to the bottom of your screen, click the reaction icon, and in that there is an option to raise your hand, or alternatively, you can just type your question into the chat. This is a really important part of our process, is to hear your feedback. And we love getting questions. So please don't be shy or hesitate to ask any questions that you guys have. Juliet, that presentation was just that clear.
Okay, great. So I'll move on to the last part of the presentation. And if there are any questions on environmental monitoring or effluent monitoring, we have another touch point at the end. But for now, I'll move on to the last part of the presentation. And this is describing how the monitoring data will be evaluated and what we will compare it against. So we've set up a two-tier system of data evaluation. The first tier will compare the monitoring results to either baseline conditions or the predictions of the EIS. The second tier will compare to a number of other benchmarks and limits, which includes drinking water limits and other federal and provincial guidelines. Just a note that at today's workshop, I'm not going to present the actual numerical values for tier 1 and tier 2 because the plans are from 2018, so they are quite a few years old, and the evaluation criteria will be updated based on more recent modeling for the EIS, as well as alignment with the near surface disposal facility follow-up monitoring program. So I just wanted to give an example of what we're expecting to see in the environment. So this is an example of the prediction for tritium and lead in the Ottawa River. Tritium and lead are the radioactive and non-radioactive parameters with the largest amount in the facility. The maximum predicted tritium in the river is modeled to be 0.04 becquerels per liter, and that's considerably lower than the Health Canada limit for tritium in drinking water, which is 7,000 becquerels per liter. And as we discussed earlier, the baseline tritium in the river is approximately 3 becquerels per liter. So the increase from the project is practically indistinguishable from background levels. For lead, the peak concentration in the river is on the order of 7 × 10⁻11 milligrams per liter, which also is much lower than guideline values of 0.001 milligrams per liter. So when we're monitoring, we want to know what we're expecting to see. So these are some examples of what we're expecting to see in the environment. This slide shows the actions CNL would take if there are exceedances in the tier 1 and tier 2 values. So if tier 1 is exceeded, the monitoring data would be reviewed, the source of the exceedance would be investigated, and the monitoring frequency could be increased. Our monitoring documents did not include the option of adding additional mitigation measures for a tier 1 exceedance, so we got that question. This is actually standard practice at CNL, but it was missed in the documentation. So we will be adding that response action under tier 1. If tier 2 is exceeded, we have the response actions listed on the screen on the second column of the table. And then for tier 2 response actions, we got feedback that CNL shouldn't wait for a tier 2 exceedance in order to implement these response actions, because tier 2 values are federal and provincial benchmarks and guidelines. So just to be clear, CNL would implement tier 2 response actions well before benchmark or guideline values are exceeded. Tier 1 exceedances would give a very early indication of unexpected monitoring results and would initiate response actions. So CNL would not wait until benchmark or guideline values are exceeded before initiating whatever response actions are necessary. Okay. All of CNL's monitoring programs are dynamic in nature. We are continually assessing our programs through a number of mechanisms and continually improving and adapting the program based on changing circumstances. Some of the main ways we improve our programs is through day-to-day evaluation of the data and adaptive management. CNL performs annual data assessments looking at trends throughout the past year and determines if any changes are required. So for example, a special investigation based on those trends. There's also an annual full program review, which reviews the program design to ensure that the program is still adequate and effective and meets our objectives. This review could result in actions like updated monitoring locations, frequencies, and parameters. And reducing monitoring frequencies, parameters, or locations would require appropriate justification. So monitoring data would be analyzed as the results are obtained, and we will be reporting the results to the CNSC on an annual basis, and the results will be available to all interested parties. So in summary, I hope this presentation gave a thorough overview of the proposed effluent and environmental monitoring activities for the NPD closure project. CNL has aligned the monitoring plans with the respective CSA standards, which outlines a very systematic method of developing monitoring programs. CNL will be transparent with the monitoring results and will incorporate adaptive management techniques to ensure that monitoring remains meaningful through time. We continue to seek feedback on these plans, and we are working very closely with several Indigenous communities and organizations to ensure that monitoring from an Indigenous perspective takes place and incorporating Indigenous knowledge to ensure protection of the environment. As I mentioned earlier, the plans are draft and they will continue to evolve. We won't finalize the plans until we receive an EA decision on the NPD closure project so that we can include any additional monitoring requirements that may be specified in the EA decision itself. So that wraps up the presentation. And now we have one last opportunity here for discussion. We are happy to discuss any questions about effluent and environmental monitoring. And as we mentioned before, there are many topics that we covered in this presentation, and many of them can be delved into quite a bit of detail. So we are offering to organize additional meetings to discuss any topics of interest in depth. So if you are interested in a technical discussion on a particular topic, feel free to reach out to us using the email address ermstakeholder@cnl.ca, and we will be happy to set up separate meetings. And then for the questions we didn't get to today, we will make sure to follow up by email. So just looking to see if there's any feedback about everything we covered today: effluent and environmental monitoring, the locations, the parameters, the frequency, the two-tiered method that we have to evaluate monitoring results, and the actions we would take if we see unexpected monitoring results, and how we incorporate adaptive management and how we will be reporting the results. Christy, do we see any questions coming in?
Yeah, I'm just monitoring the participants list. No questions yet, but as people consider these discussions, please note that we would be happy to go back and review any of the material with you that has already been presented today. So if there was something that's unclear or that you would like Juliet to go into a bit more of a deep dive, just let us know. So for the discussion question, reading it again, we do have just general feedback looking from you guys on the effluent and environmental monitoring. So consider the monitoring locations for the different parameters. Were there any parameters that were missing that are important to you all? How did you feel about the frequency of those monitoring? Was it enough? Was it too much? And yeah, how do you feel about an adaptive approach? Are there any additional or other considerations that CNL should give as they develop this program?
We're also looking for any feedback as well on the presentation itself. If you found it too detailed or not detailed enough, we do have another presentation coming up on groundwater monitoring on Thursday. So if there is any feedback on the level of detail or the duration of the presentation, feel free to let us know in the chat. We always like to improve our presentations based on the feedback that we receive.
Okay, well, we'll just hang on for a second as people contemplate these questions as well as the material. As mentioned, we do have that Thursday discussion where we'll do a deep dive on the monitoring for groundwater. So I hope you all are able to make it. It is at the same time as the session. So I look forward to seeing you all there. Any final questions for Juliet or any of the panelists before we close the meeting? Okay. Well, as Juliet mentioned, we will be getting back to those that had questions that we weren't able to answer. If you do have questions after today, as sometimes that happens to everyone, you're done the meeting and then you have all these great ideas. Just let us know through ermstakeholder@cnl.ca, and we would be happy to get back to you or set up a meeting to talk about it. And yeah, so with that, I will kind of switch gears to close the meeting as everyone kind of seems okay with everything that was covered and there's no additional questions. So as I said, we will send out responses to any questions that we didn't get to. And thank you all for taking the time today out of everyone's busy schedule. I know it's a crazy time of year right now, to provide us with input and feedback on our follow-up monitoring program. As I said, Thursday is our next technical discussion, and we'll be doing a deep dive on the ground water monitoring. So I hope that you all can be there. And with that, I hope you all have a great day. And I look forward to seeing you Thursday. Take care, everyone.